Hello ladies and gentlemen, Big Daddy Top Hat here. Previously on this channel I have managed to cover the history of every single entry in the Capcom vs series. This has meant that I have uploaded individual videos looking at each of these well-known tag team games in detail. But today we are going to go back even further than these titles and look at the first Marvel fighting game that had a Street Fighter character included. X-Men Children of the Atom is the original fighting game that Capcom developed to use Marvel characters. So today we are going to go back and analyse the existence of this game in detail. This will include looking at what elements would go on to influence the Capcom vs series and the game's legacy overall. The game seems to have had a domino effect on fighting games in general. This, ladies and gentlemen, is the mad story of X-Men Children of the Atom, the first ever Street Fighter crossover game. Yeah! Throughout the 1980s and early 90s, Marvel had allowed a number of different developers and publishers to produce games that took advantage of their famous licenses. The majority of these were pretty terrible, relying on the Marvel brand to carry the product, rather than the gameplay itself. Most home computer games were budget titles developed in Europe, and on home consoles they were usually rush jobs published by Acclaim, aka LJN. The exception to this rule were the games that had been released in the arcades, often developed in Japan. These included the likes of Sega's Spider-Man, Data East's Captain America and the Avengers, and Konami's X-Men. There were multiple fantastic beat-em-ups that had been designed to eat players' coins around the world. Amongst the brilliant games of this genre, we of course had The Punisher, an impressive title that allowed players to both brawl with enemy sprites as well as shoot them with a handgun. The game was a great technical feat, allowing over 10 enemies to appear on screen at the same time, without slowdown. Whilst Marvel were extremely pleased with Capcom's The Punisher, there was another game in existence that made the company even more keen to build on their relationship with the Japanese entity, which of course was Street Fighter 2. By now we all know the story of this one. It is one of the most successful and innovative arcade games of all time, rejuvenating an entire industry and carving out the modern fighting game niche in its image forever. Marvel could see the lucrativeness of this game, so they wanted a slice of Street Fighter 2 pie for themselves. Considering the mutual popularity of Marvel Comics, a Marvel-based fighting game seemed like a no-brainer, and a deal was struck between the two companies to make this project come to life. X-Men Children of the Atom first hit the arcades in December of 1994, and was a game that took advantage of the power of the CP System 2 arcade board. 1994 was an interesting year for Capcom and their fighting game endeavours. Not only did we see the release of Super Street Fighter 2 Turbo, the most refined version of Street Fighter yet, but we also received a feature-length Street Fighter movie. To cash in on this style of play, Capcom would also make some brand new fighting games, such as Darkstalkers, Muscle Bomber 2, and of course X-Men Children of the Atom. A lot was going on. In their own ways, each of these titles were impressive, but perhaps the X-Men game was the most intriguing of the lot, due to the fact that the characters already had a fan base and an established universe. As you can see, Capcom would do a top-notch job with this game, delivering an experience that was faithful in capturing the spirit of its namesake comics, by using colourful animation and even the use of voice actors from the X-Men animated series. The game also features a basic story that is supposedly loosely based on the franchise's Fatal Attraction storyline. So, within the game's plot, members of the X-Men set up a fighting tournament to determine who is strong enough to defeat the mutant supervillain Magneto, who wishes to eliminate the human population from his space station Avalon in order to free the oppressed mutants. The game starts out with a roster of 10 characters on the player select screen, with heroes and villains both being playable. On the hero side we have Cyclops, a mutant known for his ability to emit powerful beams of energy from his eyes. We then have Storm, who can fly and attack with wind, ice and lightning based moves, Wolverine, who has retractable claws, animal keen senses, enhanced physical capabilities and a powerful regenerative ability known as Healing Factor, Iceman, who has the ability to manipulate ice and cold by freezing water vapour around him, Colossus, who can transform himself into a metallic form, making him as hard as nails, And finally Psylocke, who has the ability to use psychic energy combined with fighting techniques. Speaking of Psylocke, what I find most amusing about her is that she did not become one of the X-Men until 1986, as prior to that she was more heavily associated with another Marvel comic book series, known as Captain Britain. Sadly, Captain Britain has not appeared in any fighting games, which is a crying shame really. According to my very brief research, Captain Britain was assigned to uphold the laws of Britain, so I guess he was probably too busy going door to door collecting TV licensing fees to appear in any fighting games. In terms of villains to players in the game, we have Omega Red, an evil serial killer born in Soviet Russia, who was experimented on by the USSR who wanted to make a super soldier like Captain America. In the game he uses his carbonadium tentacles to increase his attack range. We then have a Sentinel who is playable too. Sentinels are mutant hunting robots who are in fact heavily featured within the X-Men animated series of the 90s, and in this game function as the largest playable character. There is also Silver Samurai, who was a villain originally from a 1974 Daredevil comic, who is a Japanese mutant who uses his powers to charge his katana and wears a samurai style armour made of a silvery metal. He is notable for being the only character in this game who cannot kick, but instead uses a variety of slashes with his sword. The last initially selectable fighter is Spiral, who has 6 arms she can use to attack with at the same time, in addition to her levitating swords and shape-changing abilities. Further to this, we have the boss characters in the game, the first of which is the Juggernaut bitch. This large powerful opponent is in fact a regular human, who was empowered by a gem belonging to a deity, becoming a literal human Juggernaut. He possesses superhuman strength and durability, and even wears a helmet to protect him from psychic abilities. Although not a mutant, Juggernaut has been featured as a prominent member of the Brotherhood of Mutants. In a simple playthrough, the game's final boss fight takes place against Magneto, a powerful mutant and one of a fictional subspecies of humanity born with superhuman abilities, who has the ability to regenerate and control magnetic fields. Magneto regards mutants as evolutionary superior to humans, and rejects the possibility of peaceful human-mutant coexistence. He initially aimed to conquer the world to enable mutants, whom he refers to as Homo Superior, to replace humans as the dominant species. As spoken about in my Konami X-Men arcade video though, the character is a bit more layered than a simple villain, as it is revealed that Magneto hates humans due to being a Holocaust survivor. Obviously, we still have one more fighter to mention, bringing the total roster count up to 13. The game includes one final secret boss, Akuma from Super Street Fighter 2 Turbo, who, as you all know, was also placed in that game as a secret boss as well. Akuma's inclusion was pretty exciting, and would later help lead to the X-Men vs Street Fighter title. One thing about this though, which I must mention, because I've always found it quite amusing, is Akuma's sprite. It seems that in this game's case it has been ported straight from Super Street Fighter 2 Turbo, making his design look completely different from any of the X-Men characters, which is more than a tad lazy in my opinion. I guess we would see this same trend though in future games, for example, with characters like Morrigan still having her 1994 sprite in games like Capcom vs SNK 2. In terms of the gameplay that can be found in this X-Men title, the game shares many tropes in common with other Capcom fighters of the period. For example, contests are settled in 2 out of 3 rounds to decide a winner. The game also features a mechanic extremely similar to the gauges found in Super Street Fighter 2 Turbo and Darkstalkers, published earlier that same year, that fill up as players perform both regular and special moves. In this game's case, this function is known as the X-Power gauge. These meters start at level 1 but reach level 2 when they are half filled. When this is achieved, auras surround fighters, but more techniques can be utilised when the gauge is filled to its maximum level. These meters can be depleted in a number of ways. Firstly, players can perform an X ability which consumes a small portion of the X power gauge, or a Hyper X which consumes a greater portion of the gauge. Meter consumption is also used when breaking one's fall from a throw or performing a counter throw. The biggest innovation this title featured that was not included in its sister Capcom fighting games that year was the fact that the combo system featured long combos that could even be performed mid-air. This would mean characters could fight it out in pioneering multi-tiered environments, in which in some cases the ground crumbles and the characters fall into lower parts of the stage. This fast-paced aerial combat would be a key ingredient that would be used as part of the identity of the entire Marvel vs. Capcom series, and would be one of the main mechanics that made the game stand apart from others. This style fighting started right here in Children of the Atom. In this game there was also more subtle elements included, such as various tactical maneuvers. For example, characters had the ability to roll, something characters could not yet do in Street Fighter until the release of Street Fighter Alpha the following year. The game had plenty of features to set it apart, other than just using a massive license such as the X-Men. This included giving the players the ability to perform super jumps, and roll maneuvers could be used to roll away or towards an opponent after falling. Projectile moves could now also be used differently than in other Capcom games. Now players could aim them. The game would also present two systems where gamers could choose between a manual or automatic blocking system. There was just so many layers to all of this. Aesthetically, I have to say that this whole game looks absolutely beautiful for a sprite-based title that was released as long ago as 1994. I personally think that this game is more eye-catching than Capcom's other offerings from this same year. The cartoon-like animations and bright, beautiful multi-tiered stages look a cut above everything else that was on the market. The arcade game impressed many, and like all successes in that realm from the time period, it would of course only be a matter of time until the game would arrive on home formats. As just mentioned though, this game was freaking impressive, so getting this one home was initially quite problematic. The plan was originally to port the game to the three most powerful game consoles on the market: the Sega Saturn, the Sony PlayStation, and the 3DO. An issue that Capcom faced though was that the game used 32 megabytes worth of character data alone, and the consoles on the market at the time offered a maximum of 2 megabytes RAM in total. With it quickly becoming clear that the 3DO was a doomed system, it would not be long before that version of the game was cancelled altogether, thus meaning Capcom would only have the PlayStation and Saturn to worry about. During development of the two versions of the game, it would not be long until Capcom would end up giving up on the PlayStation conversion too, as the system's limitations were making work very difficult. This just left Capcom with the Sega Saturn to work with, and since the game was released in the pre-expansion cartridge days, even the Saturn port would need to have a third of its arcade animation frames removed from the character's movements. In regards to the Saturn version of the game, the Japanese and Western versions of the title differ, in that if you own a Japanese copy of the title, a cheat code allows players to play as the Juggernaut in the two-player versus mode. This feature was removed from international releases, with Capcom stating it was only in the Japanese version due to it being left in by mistake. Despite fewer animation frames, as an early Saturn release, the Sega Saturn game was very well received. GamePro would state the game was converted perfectly to the Saturn, and applauded the accessible controls, fast gameplay, colourful graphics, and lack of slowdown. Sega Saturn magazine also would go on to declare the conversion as arcade perfect, aside from a few barely noticeable missing animation frames, and called the game itself the first time comic book superheroes have been successfully translated to game format, which, to be fair, as we know, is definitely a massive lie. Aside from this mental hyperbole, they would praise the well-balanced combo system too. Next Generation on the other hand were less impressed with the game, complaining that 2D fighting games had been done to death, writing fighting games off as a mere fad that they predicted would soon go away. Despite their scorn for the apparently dated fighting game genre, they did admit that Children of the Atom on the Saturn had smooth animation, brightly coloured graphics, and a good balance of characters' strengths and weaknesses. Maximum would also give the game a strong review, praising the conversion and complimenting the inclusion of a new survival mode. Whilst, as mentioned earlier, Capcom gave up early on trying to convert the game to run on the Sony PlayStation. Capcom, and more importantly the game's greedy publisher, Acclaim, desperately wanted to make money off of the game, taking advantage of the PlayStation's massive user base. This would result in the project being contracted out to Probe Entertainment, who would also be tasked with developing a PC version of Children of the Atom. Due to the porting to basic hardware being so difficult, Children of the Atom would not arrive on the PlayStation until 1998, 4 years after the game's arcade release. The by at that point dated game would of course be critically panned by Next Generation, stating, Overall, if you crave 2D fighting fare, you can do worse than this game, but you can also do much better. What X-Men Children of the Atom mostly proves is that companies should learn to stop projects before they spiral past the time when they're relevant. IGN would not even dignify the game with a proper review, summarising, "We're not going to waste too much time on this game. The character animation bites, the loading time is horrible, what more do you need?" Children of the Atom would have been a 16-bit phenomenon in older times, but in our day and age, however, Children of the Atom bombs. Game Informer would also add, if this game would have been released a couple of years ago we could forgive its shortcomings, but by today's standards Children of the Atom needs to be more refined. Play the Saturn version, it's much better. Overall, on home formats, X-Men Children of the Atom reflects the usual narrative of 2D fighting games being pretty good on the Sega Saturn, but pretty terrible on the PlayStation in comparison. We have heard this story many times before, and with this game it is no different. Despite the poor conversion on one of the most popular pieces of hardware of all time, this X-Men title's influence is undeniable, and it contributed to shaping the future of fighting games in many ways. Not only did this title strengthen the working relationship between Marvel and Capcom, but we saw a Street Fighter character appear alongside the X-Men for the first time, which would spark the thought track for the full X-Men vs Street Fighter title, and all of the games that would come after it. The game would also present the genesis of the Capcom tier stage fighting, and air combat that makes the superhero fighting game so innovative. In fact, all we were missing really gameplay wise from a classic Capcom vs game were tag team matches players. Although, as we know, tag teams is where Capcom would be heading after this. So, apart from presenting the X-Men on a home console in the best light yet, the game would contribute to history on so many ambitious levels. Children of the Atom was one bloody important game. So ladies and gentlemen, if you enjoyed today's video, I have compiled a playlist which I will add to my end card that presents to you all of my other Capcom vs game videos in chronological order. So if you enjoyed this video, why not go check out all of the other videos I have made covering this sub-niche of fighting games. If you are new here, don't forget to like, subscribe and hit the notification bell to receive my weekly uploads, and leave your comment down below letting me know what your thoughts on today's content are. I have time to work on these videos as a full-time YouTuber, in part due to the thoughtful people who back this channel on Patreon, allowing me to stay focused on entertaining you all regularly. Get early access to content, vote on upcoming videos, receive production credits, and much more by backing the channel on Patreon or simply hitting the YouTube join button. Your support goes a long way in helping me do what I do, so thank you for that. Huge thank yous go out to Sebastian Velez, Carl Johnson, A Murder of Crows, Heo Paulo Lopez, Joseph Razmek, Luke Samuel Denton, Corey Imarsh Sr., Capcom vs SNK, BXL Gotham, Rowan Dinched, Evan Border, Philip Manth, Camber Rambo 82, Azrael Rarakai, Keith Ferguson, Dropkin Varela, Prince Knight, Michael Cullix, Ego, Jordan Durant, TOG Driver, Angel Light 85, Alethea Swanson, Timothy W. Haskins II, Nick Daniels, Princess Zana, Glenny Glenn, Daniel Daly, Computer Man, House of a Ted, Sponge Matt B, Gary Pinkett, ECU Professor, Aaron McNamara, Instant Gratification Monkey, Man Shovel, James Bishop, JB, Posty XL, Michael Hall, Wesley Sanghi, Ben Slightly, Langston Miller, New, Brian Barry, Stephen Lewis, Sarah Powell, Vlamic Renee, Marvin Araliga, Chris Cool, Adrian Hannington, Bernard NG, Richard Stu Stewart, James McDonald, Crazy Yarl, Dan Van Dammit, Adam Castin, Lewis Viant, John Bates, David Bow, Chris Fisk, Paul Elliott, Me Machine Dean, Mike Bruno, Rick67, Antonio Rodriguez, Hans Christian, Craig Jenkins, Tom Elliott, Retroverse.com, Casey Wright, Sin Spaces, Zai, Andrew Bazansky, and Gunther Hendricks. I would like to thank everyone so much who continues to back what I do. Yeah! Cheerio.